Look down at your dinner plate tonight. Chicken, beef, fish, pork. Whatever it is, there's a quiet rule sitting underneath it that you followed your entire life without ever once being told the rule out loud. You have never eaten a wolf. You have never eaten an eagle. You have never eaten shark steak on a Tuesday night with your family. And if someone offered you one, something in your gut would flinch before your brain even finished processing the idea. That reaction feels personal. It feels like taste, like preference, like culture. But it isn't. It's older than culture. It's older than fire. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand that the food on your plate right now was chosen for you by a process that started millions of years before your great-great-grandparents were born. And it's not the reason you think. Before we get into the strange part, you need one basic idea in your head, and it's simpler than it sounds. Imagine energy moving through nature like water poured through a stack of paper cups with holes in the bottom. You pour a full liter into the top cup. By the time it trickles down to the second cup, most of it has already leaked out. By the third cup, there's barely a splash left. That's roughly what happens to energy as it moves up what scientists call the food chain. Plants capture energy from sunlight. Something eats the plant. Something else eats that thing. And at every single step, most of the energy just evaporates as heat, motion, digestion, the ordinary cost of being alive. This means the animals sitting at the very top of that chain, the lions, the wolves, the orcas, the great white sharks, are living on the smallest trickle of energy left in the entire system. And that one detail is going to matter more than you think in about 90 seconds. Now let's start stacking the evidence, because this is where it stops being a biology lesson and starts being a genuinely strange piece of detective work. And somewhere in this next few minutes, there's a fact I'm going to hold back for a bit, because it's the one that actually changes how you'll think about meat for the rest of your life. Stick with me. First piece of evidence, the math simply doesn't work in a predator's favor. A large land predator can require somewhere around 15 to 20 pounds of prey meat a day just to keep its own body running. That's an enormous amount of biological cost concentrated into one animal. For early humans, hunting always came down to a brutal cost-benefit calculation: risk versus reward, danger versus calories. Chasing down an antelope was dangerous but efficient. Trying to bring down an actual lion, one of the few animals on the savannah that could kill you just as easily as you could kill it, for a smaller, tougher, leaner amount of meat, was a losing trade in almost every possible sense. Our ancestors weren't cowards, they were accountants, and the math told them over and over again, across tens of thousands of years, don't bother. Which honestly feels a little funny when you think about it. Humanity's entire diet was shaped less by bravery and more by an ancient, unspoken spreadsheet nobody ever wrote down. Second piece of evidence, and this one is genuinely underappreciated. Predators are walking storage units for everything that ever went wrong below them in the food chain. Researchers studying wildlife contamination in the mid-20th century began noticing something troubling along North American lakes and coastlines. Birds sitting at the very top of local food chains, ospreys, eagles, were producing eggs with shells so thin they cracked under their own mother's weight. It took years of tracing the problem backward to understand what was happening. Pollutants entering the water in tiny, seemingly harmless amounts were being absorbed by small organisms, which were eaten by bigger fish, which were eaten by bigger fish still. And at each step, the concentration didn't dilute, it multiplied. By the time it reached the birds at the top, the harmless trace amount from the bottom of the chain had become something that could end a species. Scientists eventually gave this effect a name: biomagnification. It's the same reason doctors today tell pregnant women to be careful with tuna, of all things. Not because tuna is unusually dangerous, but because it sits high enough on the ocean's food chain to have quietly collected decades of mercury nobody put there on purpose. Which raises an obvious question you're probably already asking. If a fish that swims in open ocean can carry that kind of invisible baggage, What exactly is sitting inside an animal that has spent 15 years eating other predators? That's the fact I've been holding back. And here it is, plain and simple. The biggest reason predator meat never became human food isn't danger, and it isn't taste. It's that top predators are essentially biological filing cabinets, storing a lifetime's worth of everything toxic that passed through every animal beneath them, concentrated, compounded, and handed to whoever eats them next. That's it. That's the whole secret hiding under something as ordinary as a dinner plate. Say that one out loud a few times, and it stops sounding like trivia and starts sounding like something your ancestors somehow knew before anyone had the word toxin. Because here's the third piece of evidence, and it's the one that makes this feel less like chemistry and more like inherited memory. Long before anyone understood biomagnification, humans already had a built-in gut-level aversion to eating carnivorous animals. Psychologists studying disgust, yes, that's an actual field of research, have found that this specific aversion shows up across cultures with no contact with one another, and even in small children who haven't been taught anything about food safety. It's not table manners. It's not squeamishness we picked up from our parents. It behaves like something wired in early, something that got carried forward precisely because the people who felt it survived more often than the people who didn't. Somewhere back in deep time, an ancestor who felt nothing about eating a fox or a wolf occasionally paid for that indifference with a slow, miserable illness. An ancestor who felt an inexplicable wave of no, absolutely not toward the same meat just didn't. And so that feeling got passed down, generation after generation, not as a rule written on a wall, but as a flicker of discomfort in your stomach that you've never once had to think about. Which is a strange thing to sit with, that your instincts might be quietly reciting a warning your ancestors never had the language to write down. Fourth piece of evidence, and this one's a little grosser, so consider yourself warned. Predators that regularly eat raw flesh also tend to carry parasites specifically adapted to that lifestyle. Organisms that have had millions of years to specialize in exactly this kind of transmission. One of the most well-documented is a tiny parasite that lives in muscle tissue and, if consumed in undercooked meat, can migrate into a person's own muscles, causing swelling, fever, and in historical cases, death. Bear meat, one of the few predator meats humans have occasionally eaten throughout history, is one of the most consistently documented sources of exactly this kind of infection, which is exactly why every culture that did eat bear developed strict, almost ritualistic rules about cooking it thoroughly, not out of superstition, out of hard-earned, repeated experience. Now, before you assume this rule is absolute, there's a wrinkle worth mentioning because nature rarely deals in clean, tidy categories. Humans do eat some predators: squid, octopus, certain sharks, alligator in some regions, animals that are ferocious hunters in their own right. The pattern that emerges when you look closely isn't never eat a predator, it's closer to the higher up the chain and the older the animal, the worse the math gets. A young, fast-lift predator carries far less accumulated baggage than one that spent decades at the very top. The rule was never about predators specifically, it was always about accumulation. So here's where this stops being a story about lions and sharks and starts being a story about us. Because that same logic, that things at the top of a system quietly accumulate the cost of everything beneath them, it didn't disappear when we stopped hunting mammoths, it just changed shape. Industrial fishing fleets today still pull mercury-heavy predator fish out of the ocean and sell them at a premium, marketed as luxury, because scarcity and danger have always made humans strange, willing to pay more for the very thing biology spent millions of years teaching us to avoid. In parts of the world, exotic meat markets openly sell big cat and shark products, sometimes for status, sometimes for supposed medicinal power that has never once held up to scrutiny. And every time, it's the same ancient trade, risking accumulated toxins and depleting apex predators that entire ecosystems depend on for the sake of proving something about wealth or masculinity or rarity. The instinct that once protected our ancestors gets overridden the moment status enters the picture. We didn't lose the warning, we just learned, sometimes, to ignore it on purpose. There's something almost humbling in that The same species that built an elaborate, invisible, inherited early warning system against a genuinely dangerous category of food is also the only species smart enough and stubborn enough to talk itself out of listening to it. So go back to that plate in front of you. Chicken, beef, fish. Ordinary food chosen for you before you ever had a say in the matter by generations of ancestors who never saw a microscope, never heard the word biomagnification, and never once needed to. They just felt it. A quiet, wordless, not that one, passed down, mouth to mouth, meal to meal until it became instinct and then became you. Every plate of food you've ever eaten is, in its own small way, a message from people who never got to meet you, telling you exactly what not to touch. So here's the real question worth sitting with. How many other instincts are you carrying around right now, quietly protecting you that you've never once stopped to ask where they came from?